Disclaimer, I'm a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Let's talk about someone else I have not discussed on this channel so far. Amazing. So, Sargon of Akkad. Most people who are watching my content are probably familiar with this guy. Are probably familiar with this with this intellectual big boy. With this just well, I mean, like, every time I've heard of him, or at least that people have, like, commented about him to me on my videos, people always say that he would completely destroy me in the debate if I ever had one with him. So, hey, you know, let's see if it'll ever happen, you know? I think that'd be fun. I think that'd be interesting. So he made a video talking about Lindsay Ellis's video in the canceling of J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling, get the fuck out of my life. I'm so done with you. I'm so done with you. Like, occupying so much of my fucking life and existence at this point. But this has some interesting arguments in it, specifically about trans. Like, it boils down to trans people, right? It's always fucking trans people. Fuck me. So yeah, we're gonna listen to him, and we're gonna see what he says, and we're gonna respond appropriately. So let's get going.
This video is going to be very complicated, and I run the risk of getting in some trouble with the powers that be, because
that's vague.
I'm going to be taking the side of notorious TERF J.K. Rowling in the debate on the biological influence of one's chromosomes over one's sex and over one's gender. And I will be in opposition to a YouTuber called Lindsay Ellis. And
also, just want to say, as a rule of thumb, in case people haven't figured it out, actually, you know what? Not even as a rule of thumb. Like, before we get too far into this, if your position, like the position that if the position that you're taking is to side with a pretty open transphobe and to, like, oppose, like, Lindsay, you know, from what I know about her content, is, like, pretty cool, pretty knowledgeable, she just put a book out, from what I understand, you know, pretty knowledgeable person. I'm not sure if that's the best way to posture yourself, but hey, you know, let's hear it.
Riley Dennis, Lindsay Ellis is a cultural critic, a film critic, and so we're going to be going through quite a lot of this. I'll try and keep it as simple as I can, because I think this is actually quite straightforward if you just know how to lay it out. And so let's begin. Lindsay, what's the problem?
So I've been seeing a lot of people on Twitter, a lot of which are in my mentions, discussing Death of the Author and asking how we should apply this to our newly out and proud, incredibly transphobic J.K. Rowling. The warning signs were there. You kind of began, it was like a few months ago when people were noticing that she was liking some really hardcore right-wing TERFy tweets, TERF meaning trans-exclusionary radical feminist.
So J.K. Rowling is a TERF, a gender-critical feminist who is opposed to the intersectional feminists on the basis of what...
I love that he, like, has to reposture it to gender-critical, right? Which, at some point, was, like, their way of rebranding it to try and make it sound more reasonable. Like, this isn't someone who doesn't know anything about these issues. Like, that shows at least a degree of knowledge on these subject matters.
It is to be a woman.
Like, just within the last 24 hours, we have her comparing providing gender services to young people with gay conversion therapy, linking to fringe weirdos and Medium posts like it's like some authority.
Well, we definitely don't want public figures who get millions of views promoting fringe weirdos to their audiences, do we, Lindsay? So what are you using as the...
I think that someone else covered this video and actually mentioned it. Was that just a dig against trans people? I think that was just a dig against trans people, calling them, like, fringe weirdos. But hey, he didn't say it explicitly, so I can't say anything conclusive, but I think it's pretty clear that that's, like, the insinuation, right? So I'll let you as the audience to decide.
bedrock of your own beliefs in opposition to J.K. Rowling.
Biological sex is...
In opposition to J.K. Rowling.
Biological sex is, in fact, much more complicated than the simple X and Y chromosome. Trans YouTuber Riley Dennis did a video on the subject a few years ago, so I'll go ahead and link to that, and I'll let her speak to that issue. That's not what we're talking about.
Ah yes, trans YouTuber Riley Dennis, who doesn't believe in biological sex. Definitely not a fringe weirdo. So
Hold on. Because a lot of people make this straw man, alright? But let's look at what even the thumbnails, alright? Sargon just said that she doesn't believe in biological sex, alright? Let's see what even the thumbnails say. Biological sex is a social construct, or quote-unquote biological sex is BS. You know what? Let's talk about this. Let's talk about some scientific consensus, shall we? Let's just bring out the receipts, because I can see where this argument is going. So first, let's talk about... So the first thing, right? Because he brought up like the definition of a woman. So let's talk about this first basic idea of, does biological sex determine someone's gender? Well, according to the American Psychological Association, gender identity refers to a person's internal sense of being male, female, or something else. Gender expression refers to a way that person communicates gender identity to others through behavior, clothing, hairstyles, voice, or body characteristics. Furthermore, according to the United Kingdom's National Health Service, gender identity is defined to refer to our sense of self, or who we are and how we describe ourselves. The NHS explains that most people identify as male or female, which are sometimes called binary identities, but some people feel their gender identity is different from their biological sex. All right? So the analysis is that gender identity and gender expressions are not mutually inclusive with one's biological identity, and therefore, biological sex does not determine someone's gender. So let's be clear. This means that like when we're considering like whether or not someone is a woman or a man or something else, does biological sex as a term factor into that consideration? And the answer is no, it doesn't. In this sense, we can think of like womanhood as more of an identity. And especially if we're looking at a Judith Butler way of looking at it, it's an identity based on how society treats you based on your gender expression, how you express yourself to society and how society receives that expression, right? That's it. Now, to get into the deeper argument about whether or not a trans woman is biologically male and vice versa, right? We're getting into like the biological sex argument. Here is a graphic from Scientific American demonstrating the many characteristics which factor into one's sexual identity. This shows the ambiguous and bimodal nature of sex, and that sex is not as simple as XX and XY. Biological sex is on a bimodal distribution, not a direct binary. Additionally, here's a quote from a publication in Sage Journals of the Modern Scientific Attitudes on Human Sex. Quote, "The view that the world's population can be separated into a clearly defined dyadic unit of male and female is defunct. Not only clinical observations, but molecular biology has established that sexual identity is on a continuum with enormous potential for variance." The analysis is that the modern scientific consensus is that binary terms, like biological male and biological female, because mind you, if you have a spectrum of sexual characteristics and people fall along this spectrum, it raises the question of whether or not someone, or at what point someone falls into this category of biological male or biological female. All right? And the answer is that when you have a spectrum, when we choose when people fall into those categories, it's completely arbitrary. Right? It's decided by society. And in that sense, at least based on what Riley Dennis said in her thumbnail, that's what it means to say that this is a societal construct. Because when people fall along a spectrum, it's not science that says when someone is a man or a woman, but it's society that makes a normative judgment about when to assign those roles to people. All right? And so, when you try to use a term like biological male and biological female to describe what is societally constructed, it is scientific fiction. Okay? That's the argument. And so the conclusion is that no, trans women are not biologically male, and vice versa for trans men. Okay? So to the extent that Riley is representing Riley, oh my god, there's another Riley. But to the extent that Riley is saying biological sex is a social construct and biological sex is BS, at least based on this, I don't know her particular arguments, but like, I'm inclined to agree with this. It seems entirely reasonable. And mind you, this isn't saying that biological sex doesn't exist. All right? It's just saying that it exists on a spectrum, and that when we assign people into categories, that is decided by society, not by science. Okay? That's it. That's the scientific consensus. So that's just a straw man that he proposed, that she doesn't believe in biological sex. Or I assume that he's going to play some clips, so let's listen to that.
So we have to take a segue off of the path of Lindsay Ellis's train of thought in order to figure out what exactly it is that Riley Dennis is proposing. Now, Lindsay linked two different videos, but both dealing with the same subject, and called some variant of the phrase, biological sex does not exist. J.K. Rowling is in direct opposition to this assertion.
You gotta love that he has to say, in some variation says biological sex doesn't exist. He has to paraphrase it, because if he says what she actually said, then people would realize, or at least begin to suspect, that he's just misrepresenting what she's saying. You gotta love that. You gotta love it. It makes me wonder whether or not he's intentionally misrepresenting her, or if he's just like completely ignorant to the modern scientific consensus. I don't know. I can't speculate. I will leave that to you to decide as the audience.
She believes that sex is real, and sex being real is the basis of, say, things like same-sex partnerships or women's experiences in the world, which is what Lindsay actually links to. And then she goes on to say that, in fact, nobody is saying that biological sex doesn't exist.
And as is the case with so many trans folks, she is arguing against a position that nobody actually has.
The two
True. Can I get some trues in chat? True. Damn, Lindsay, you're just you make the arguments for me. We're on the same page. We're on the same page, you and I. I feel like I'm in sync with her. This is great.
videos she is citing are specifically arguing that biological sex isn't real.
And as is the
Nope. At least based on what he's shown us so far. He hasn't shown us any evidence to that effect, like, at this point whatsoever. Even based on the thumbnails, that doesn't support his argument whatsoever. So no, he's just either lying, or he's either lying intentionally or unintentionally misrepresenting what she's saying based on what he's shown us so far.
the case with so many trans folks, she is arguing against a position that nobody actually has.
Biological sex has to undergo the same paradigm shift that gender did. We need to start thinking about it as a social construct rather than an inarguable fact. So if you're a
True. Based on what, yeah, this is entirely true based on what we just talked about. I love that. Yeah, I mean, like, this is consistent so far with everything that we discussed. So I'm not hearing anything that says that biological sex isn't real, right? But let's go on.
trans woman, you're female. If you're a trans man, you're male.
There's a part of me that wonders
True. Yeah, that's true.
if Lindsay's aware of this. But what I find really
Hold on, I have to slow it down a little bit because they're playing clips a little bit faster, so we'll go at 1.5. But I love that he's continuing to posture what she is saying as saying that biological sex isn't real, and that's not what she's saying at all.
interesting
And also the fact that he, like, quoted Lindsay saying that that's not a position that she has or that anyone has, right? Like, he's just unable to understand the arguments that people are making, which, hey, you know, like, Carl, like, you know, sometimes people just don't understand things, and that's fine. And, you know, like, if you're willing to learn, then we're willing to help you. But you gotta give it some effort and actually, like, listen and consider the argument first. So I don't know, do some homework, dude.
is this bit.
No one is saying chromosomes are not real, Joanne.
True.
As you're going to see, that's only because they can't. They have argued that everything else
What?
doesn't exist, but chromosomes are the last piece in the puzzle that they can't make go away. And so Riley Dennis's conclusion is that chromosomes don't do anything.
Hold on, this is entirely speculation to say that the only reason that people haven't argued against the existence of chromosomes is because they can't, is suggesting a mindset that people want to try and argue them away. And that's nothing that anyone wants to do. We're just following the modern majority scientific consensus. That is it, all right? There's nothing about trying to argue away, like, a biological reality or trying to, like, argue away some scientific consensus or some scientific fact. This is just about, like, following where the science is at and being as realistic and honest about it as possible. Period. So, like, right now, the only person who's arguing against science is you, Carl. Like, if you're arguing that, like, what she is saying is scientifically inaccurate, like, you're the one in the wrong here. So, like, yeah, I don't know. Get dunked on.
Let's take a look at Riley's argument and see how she gets to the conclusion that biological sex is a social construct.
Chromosomes themselves
Oh, he actually, like, represented what she actually said. Amazing. I didn't know that that was possible.
are not social constructs, but deciding to call XX chromosomes female and XY chromosomes male is a social construct.
True! Oh my god, this is literally what I said earlier. This is literally, I mean, like, not in these exact terms, but, like, essentially the argument that I made earlier. I love this. Oh my god, Riley, Lindsay, and I, we're all on the same page. We're all mentally linked in this moment. I love it. We're collaborating across space-time to, like, defeat transphobia and to defeat anti-intellectualism. I love it. All right, but let's keep listening. I feel like she's about to be spitting some hard facts and some hard truth.
Now, I'm not saying that classifying things is wrong or that we shouldn't try to understand bodies at all, but I do think we could do it better.
So Riley is taking a fundamental
Yeah. No, that's all completely fine. What's your problem with it, Carl?
contention with the accuracy of the language that we are using for. Now, I think it's important to note that at this point, the Darwinian
What?
position on sex is that procreation is the purpose of courtship.
What does that matter, Carl? Why should I care about the Darwinian model of biology or sex. Why should I care, Carl? I mean, if it's contrary to the modern majority scientific consensus, I don't have to give a rat's ass about it. And that's really where the buck stops on that, isn't it? If it's not consistent with the majority scientific consensus, I don't care what he thought like 100 or some odd years ago. We've clearly advanced and learned more about the nature of sex since whenever Charles Darwin was fucking alive.
The gender roles of man and woman exist to facilitate this courtship, and this is why they are tied to the reproductive roles of male and female, which has the ultimate goal of siring children.
Yes. The only purpose, like the sole purpose that people have to maintain labels of male and female is to make babies. That's the only importance of the social roles that you inhabit. Sorry, like men and women, that the only importance to those roles is to make babies. You better be out in there. You better be out there making the babies. That's the basic biological function of being male or female. Get out there and make them babies, guys and gals, and then pals. Okay, Carl.
But Riley's position is actually a lot more direct than that.
What you need for reproduction is one person who can produce functioning sperm and one person who can produce functioning ova. Our
True.
decision to call people who usually can produce sperm male and people who can usually produce ovum female is a system that we invented. And you don't stop being female if you can't produce functioning ovum.
True. Oh my God, Riley, you're just spitting hard fact here. It's the coalition of the Rileys. It's Rileys unite against fucking transphobia and anti-intellectualism. I love it. But yeah, I mean, like, literally, like, this is what we were talking about earlier, right? When someone, like, we, of course, are not going to argue that, like, these features are not seen in people, but when you decide to define them as certain societal terms, it is society deciding to name those given terms, right? Like, actually, there was a great, people should go look up this after the fact. There's a really good TED Talk about the nature of, like, XX and XY chromosomes and how they've actually gone through a long history of various different names before people just arbitrarily decided to settle on XX and XY. So even with those chromosomes, like, it's completely arbitrary, and it could have ended up as, like, a number of different things, a number of different names, but we just as a society decided arbitrarily to name them what they are, right? So nah, Riley's just spitting some straight fact here. As she should. I'm very proud of Riley.
Words themselves are indeed things we created, but the words themselves have been created in order to describe real and objectively measurable phenomena that we have encountered in our daily lives. And
yes, but how did we decide what words to make them, Carl? How did we decide what to call them, Carl? That's the question that we're getting at. No one is disputing that XX and XY chromosomes are describing something which is real. What people are disputing is how you got to those names. Because the fact of the matter is, someone had to make the decision to call those chromosomes XX or XY. That was a person or group of people who made that determination. It wasn't just something, like, inscribed onto the chromosomes themselves. It was something that someone decided to call it. And then people started calling it that. Arbitrarily. So, yeah, no one's disputing that the chromosomes or the names them refer to something real. But how we got to those names was based on what people just decided to call them. That's it.
our ancient ancestors would have encountered long before we even had speech. This is understood. I mean, animals have biological sexes. Doing it better in Riley's view is the abolition of the categories, our criterion that make male and female male and female.
Did she ever say that? Did she ever say to abolish the criteria, like to abolish chromosomes or to abolish? Like, she's not calling for abolition. She's calling for recognition that these terms are societally constructed. That's not abolishing them. That's just recognizing them for what they are. You're the one who is strawmanning her completely by saying that she's trying to abolish them. She never at once said any of that.
This has already been done with the gender roles man and woman, and so now this has come to the sort of final stop. It's got to be done with the biological sex.
Yes, because civilization is just crumbling around us from the gendered categories of male and female being abolished, or man and woman being abolished. Let me just look out the window and see. I mean, Baltimore is pretty often burning, but let me just look out and see. Is the end of the world happening? Is the end of the world happening? No? Amazing. It's almost as if, recognizing that these terms are societally constructed really doesn't affect society all that much, if at all. Except, you know, positively, because now we understand more about like how we got to where we are and people can understand more about themselves. Maybe that's a possibility, Carl. Maybe that's a possibility, Carl. I don't know. I'm just here thinking out loud. But you know, in the world, when the world ends around us and it's not caused by some collection of global warming, fascism, or pandemics, then hit me up, because then I'll eat my words.
Because otherwise, there is going to be something that is biologically male, biologically female, and then there will be an other, a label that is either transgender or hermaphrodite, and that is exclusionary by its very nature. Because it is not fitting into these definitions, it is being excluded, and if we don't want to be exclusive, we have to get rid of these definitions. And I'm not exaggerating.
What? What's this argument, Carl? Is this like a backwards argument for inclusivity by trying to say that people are not transgender, or if they are transgender, they're not authentically men or women if they identify as such? What's this backwards argument for inclusivity? Like, can we just be on, like, can we just be like very matter of fact and like recognize that like when you are trying to say that a trans woman is not a woman and a trans man is not a man and a non-binary person is not non-binary, you are being exclusionary and prejudiced towards them, right? Because you're normalizing the idea that they're not the people who they say that they are. And by normalizing the idea, you're normalizing laws in society, which make it harder for them to get by. You make it, you normalize beliefs, which don't see those people to be who they are. And you normalize hate against those people, right? So let's be clear. Like, this is some backwards ass logic to try and make yourself sound inclusive, but you're being anything but. Hold on. What are you? You have a JK stand in chat? Then all right, deal with them. I don't care. They can, if they really want to make like shit happen, then they can come over to the Discord. But I have segments planned and I want to get through them. All right, let's keep going.
This is how she does it.
It's not like all people with penises fit into one box and all people with vaginas fit into another box. It's like they're all in the same box, but people with penises tend to hang out on one side and people with vaginas tend to hang out on the other.
As you can see, she has taken away the criterion of male and female, the two boxes, and obliterated them. So now there is no male and female.
No, she hasn't. Again, you just keep strawmanning her. She's not obliterating the categories of male and female, or rather man and womanhood, but she's acknowledging that we have assigned these categories arbitrarily and that there's a lot more nuance in between. That's it.
And simply, people with penises are on, just generally on one side of a grand box that encompasses the entire human species, and people without on the other side. It's actually the destruction of the ideas of male and female that is what Riley is driving at.
Female implies...
No, it's not. I mean, sure, if we're talking about like the reality, like the scientific consensus that biological, or that terms like biological male and biological female, as we've already discussed, again, he keeps suggesting this argument, but like, if we're just talking about like the scientific consensus on this, she's not saying anything contrary to the scientific consensus. And she's not trying to abolish like male or female. She's acknowledging that terms like biological male and biological female are societally constructed, which is the majority scientific consensus. Period.
Woman. Woman implies female. Keeping the traditional definition of female means continuing to make trans women an abnormality, something unusual and different and weird.
But the thing is, they are different, aren't they? They're not actually the same as biological women, and we can't, from an evolutionary perspective, pretend that they are. I mean, if our appropriate expectation for finding a partner to settle down with and start a family includes finding a fertile partner of the opposite sex...
Again, he's literally just like boiling down like the entirety of men and women and the roles that they inhabit in society to your ability to have a baby. Well, sorry, women who are cis but who are still infertile, I guess you're not actually a woman because you can't have a baby. Unfortunate. I mean, yeah, obviously, like, there are going to be some differences between, like, trans and cis women, right? Like, yeah, no one is arguing contrary to that. But that doesn't mean that trans women are not defined as women, because they are. And that is the scientific consensus. And that's all that she's saying.
then yes, being transgender is something unusual that actually stops that process. We have to be able to identify and deal with the fact that we can't sire children with someone who is biologically of the same sex as us.
Again, using completely arbitrary. Again, like he's using categories which are scientific fiction. He's using he's wrongly assuming what she's saying. I'm not gonna try. I'm gonna try and not beat it into the dirt as much, but yeah, like let's agree that he's wrong, or at least based on the evidence I presented to you. You can make your own judgment about whether or not the evidence I presented is satisfactory or not.
Trans inclusive means recognizing that we should not be calling trans women male. Calling a trans woman male implies to most people that she's a man, which is inaccurate.
Biological sex
True.
has to undergo the same paradigm shift that gender did. We need to start thinking about it as a social construct rather than an inarguable fact. I would argue
True.
that sex needs to go through the same change that gender has already gone through. It's not a static fact.
This is pure ideology. Searching for terminological accuracy, if you were trying to find a mate, could, by Riley's definitions, end up with you marrying a person who does not produce the opposite gametes to yourself.
Pure ideology. Pure ideology. Hey fam, it's just in. It's just in. Following science is now pure ideology. I mean, is this like Trumpism, right? Is this like Trump trying to acknowledge that, that the coronavirus being as widespread of an issue as it is, or like refusing to acknowledge that issue because it's just ideologically based? Are we just at Trumpism now? Like the saying that like her opinion isn't valid, like even though she follows science because you're labeling it as ideology? Is that where we have arrived to? This is a nonsensical argument. It's not like it appears to be based off of this like very particular definition of what it means to be a man and a woman based on like what Darwin said a fucking like 100 some odd years ago. It doesn't matter. Like if it's contrary to the majority scientific consensus, I really don't care what he said. Period.
And therefore will never give you offspring. If the ultimate purpose of your dating life is to settle down and have kids, then this definition actually leaves us open to not achieving that. We might pair with someone who does not fit the required criteria, and even us voicing that complaint could be called transphobia.
You may have heard the terms hermaphrodite or hermaphrodism used, but these are widely considered to be outdated, inaccurate, and hurtful words, so please don't use them to refer to intersex people.
To protect the feelings of hermaphrodites and anyone else who feels that they fall outside of the male-female binary, Riley has abolished this otherwise useful term that then brings on the further problem of how to legitimize male and female, and to solve this problem, she has abolished those as well. So now there is no male.
This is the same argument as before. I'm not going to rehash it, but yeah, he's just strawmanning her.
There is no female, there are just humans with genitals, and they're all in the same category, purely because some people might feel like they're being excluded and that it is hurtful. Because
he was half right. First, let's be clear, because biological sex is on a continuum. Yeah, like, at the end of the day, we're all just humans. That is the scientific consensus. Yeah, you kind of hit it on the head there. Now, the reasoning that you gave for why she's saying this is completely off the mark. The reason that she's saying it is because it's what scientists believe. And it's where the science is at, Carl. That's it. There's no ulterior motive to try and abolish these roles in society and to try and, like, ruin Western civilization. Like, this has nothing to do with that. You're just completely speculating there. And you're not a mind reader, Carl, but I can certainly make a pretty good guess based on the evidence I have presented that she's not trying to do what you're suggesting her to do, or at least not do it with the mentality that you're suggesting.
As we are dealing with an imperfect process that can be modified after the fact through surgery or hormones or whatever, this means to Riley that the imperfections of the system are delegitimizing the entire system. Because if you can't simply categorize hermaphrodites as a third category that are not the same as males and not the same as females, either neither or both, then this is somehow not speaking to a fundamental truth about the human condition.
He's just extrapolating here. I don't understand what he's trying to get at with this. Like, this is unrelated to Riley's argument.
But that's only because you got rid of the category of hermaphrodite because you found it offensive.
Because sex has never been only about chromosomes. It's been about all 5
It's not about finding it offensive. It's about being scientifically accurate.
of these traits. And tell me, what good does dividing people based on their chromosomes do?
Well, the good it does is actually social and emotional. I mean, I can completely see the argument from a mother's point of view that she doesn't want biologically male people in a changing room with, say, herself and her 10-year-old daughter or something.
This is just the changing room argument. Oh my fucking god. Hold on, have I done research? I'm pretty sure I've done research on this. This is just the fucking bathroom argument, alright? So first, okay, I do have research on this. Wonderful. So, Carl's bringing up this argument. All right, Carl's bringing up this argument that, oh, so why would we want these biological categories? Or why would we want these categories to be institutionalized? Well, because it might make some people feel better. Like, for example, mothers who don't want, like, biological males to go into, changing rooms and possibly harassing them or other people, right? So let's talk about that fear, all right? Because there's a lot of literature on it. So, issue. Are concerns of trans predators in bathrooms, changing rooms, etc., empirically valid? So let's talk about some rules, all right? In 2018, a study was published in the Journal of Sexuality Research and Social Policy, which discussed how legislation, regulations, litigation, and ballot proposals affecting public restroom access for transgender people increased drastically in the last 3 years, and how opponents of gender identity-inclusive public accommodations, non-discrimination laws, often cite fear of safety and privacy violations in public restrooms if such laws are passed, while proponents argue that such laws are needed to protect transgender people and concerns regarding safety and privacy violations are unfounded. What they found was that no empirical evidence has been gathered to test such laws' effects, and furthermore, that this study provides evidence that fears increased safety and privacy violations as a result of non-discrimination laws are not empirically grounded. There's no evidence that these fears are empirically grounded whatsoever. Furthermore, according to Rain, most rapes and sexual assaults, like 8 out of 10, are committed by someone the victim knew, not random men and women claiming to be transgender going into bathrooms. Additionally, according to their analysis of rape and sexual assaults in the US, 48% of survivors were at home, sleeping or performing another activity at home, 29% were traveling, running errands, etc., 12% were working, 7% at school, and 5% were doing an unknown other activity. Therefore, it can be inferred that rapes in bathrooms are very rare overall, and even then, it's not because of trans people. So the analysis is that there is no empirical evidence to show that these concerns about trans predators are rooted in anything else except for discriminatory prejudices against trans people, and therefore these concerns are not empirically valid. So let's be clear. The only, he's suggesting that, by talking about this, sure, he's specifically citing a fear that a mother may have, but let's be real, let's be clear. Those fears that a mother and Carl, if he shares those fears, would have, and any other people who would share these fears, are completely irrational, are not based in empirical evidence, and are primarily rooted in bias against trans people. Period. All right? So that's not a valid excuse to be able to allow these categories to exist, Carl. There's no evidence for them except for someone's irrational fear.
Something like this. And it means that this sort of sex segregation is generally considered to be positive for women's protection. Again, these are very much contingent, real-world, empirical factors that are being considered here, but that's not the
empirical, real-world factors to be considered. Sure. Don't want to go full screen.
Discussion that Riley's having. Riley's having a purely theoretical discussion. And from the position of this...
You're the one having a purely theoretical discussion, insofar as she's talking about scientific literature or the scientific consensus, and you're just not. You're talking about, our outdated Darwinian model of what it means to be a sex or to be a biological sex. The only one who's talking, in anything resembling theoretical discussion is you.
This theoretical discussion, she is trying to reverse engineer what it is to be either male or female.
Nope.
To the point where she can suggest that certain categories actually can be ticked off by use of surgery or hormones or any other physical modifications or lack of ability to perform, and therefore this undermines the very nature of what it is to be male and female.
They would have female hormones, secondary sex characteristics, and genitals. So 3 of their 5 ways of determining sex would be female. They wouldn't have male or female gonads at that point, and let's assume their chromosomes are XY. That means that 3/5 of the sex criteria point to female, and only 1/5 points to male.
Riley can go through this...
Yeah. This isn't trying to abolish a category. This is trying to call out why a category isn't scientific, right? This is pointing out how categories which are arbitrarily assigned by society can sometimes have flaws in them. Like if you try to say that an AMAB person is male by virtue that they have, for example, a specific type of genitalia, well, we live in a world where that's not always the case. And so you have to shift the definition if you want to try and maintain some biological essentialism worldview. And when you keep doing that, you start to realize more and more how much a term like biological male is constructed by society.
This list and knock them all down until she gets to the very bedrock, which is the chromosomes, the immalleable biological part of a person's body that they just don't
No one has disagreed with this.
have the power to change. In all of the things, they may have removed their gonads, they may have removed their genitals, they may have removed their secondary sex characteristics, and they may be pumping themselves full of hormones that create the change within the body that transitions them from male to female. But fundamentally, they will never have the chromosomes of the opposite sex. And
I'm always curious because here's the thing. A lot of people used to make a very similar argument about genitalia. Like way back in the day, it used to be a very popular argument to make against trans people that they would never be like authentically the gender that they would purport to be because of their genitalia. But then lo and behold, eventually we got to the point where, medical discovery and medical technology, medical practices caught up and eventually made that possible, right? Through something like bottom surgery. And then the conversation shifted to, okay, well, they'll never look or sound like a woman. And then lo and behold, we discovered advances in like hormone replacement therapy and facial feminization surgery, right? And every single time they have pushed back, like, and it's funny because like the position that Carl is taking has been pushed back more and more and more over society. And so what I'm very curious if Carl ever decides to like review this, is if he would agree with the idea that if we got to a point in society where, let's say, through the introduction of like nanotechnology, that you could change a trans woman, just for example, a trans woman's chromosomes to be XX, so that you could change those so that those are authentically XX in her bloodstream, like in her biology. If you would then finally acknowledge these people as authentically women, right? I'm very speculative and I'm very hesitant in thinking that he would actually then acknowledge these people, us, to be trans women, right? Because these people, like every single time a medical advancement has been made, these people will always shift the goalposts to push it further and further back so that they can maintain a biological essentialist worldview. And let's be real, it's very likely with the introduction and the studies in the nanotechnology that like this is going to be a conversation that's probably going to happen at some point within our lifetime, or if not ours, probably the lifetime after ours or the generation after ours, right? And I'll be very curious to see what people, or especially transphobes, will be saying at that point. Because at that point, there's really nothing that they could point to other than the fact that you were born as something that's different to how you are now.
it's artificially and externally that these other modifications have been made. Because left to its own devices, the body and the chromosomes in the body would produce gonads, genitals, secondary sex characteristics, and the sex-appropriate hormones for that biological sex. So it's only through great effort and actually acting against the inclination and natural development of one's own body that we can get to a position that we can say, actually, these things don't even exist. It is only by knocking off.
Yeah, I love this argument. It's only because you do certain things which aren't found in natural bodies that you're able to get to such a point where people are at if they transition medically. What does that matter? I mean, really, what does that matter? Because if you're making an argument that like this goes like some essentialist argument that like by virtue of the fact that you go against what you were assigned at birth or like your biological like where you started from, and that somehow makes you intrinsically something contrary to what you might identify as if you are trans. I mean, what's the merit to that argument, right? Because I really don't care what I was or how I was treated so many odd years ago. What matters is how I'm treated nowadays. And if we're making an appeal to like the natural biological reality of someone, that people shouldn't engage in like natural things which go against what their body would do on its own, I mean, that's kind of like an argument against like any medical advancement ever, right? I mean, what does this mean, that we shouldn't use glasses because they're not like naturally found in nature? Does this mean that we shouldn't use like medicinal advancements because they aren't found naturally in nature, and we should let the body do what it wants to on its own? I mean, I'm trying to understand the nature and the basis for this argument, because I really don't care what people were before. And if you're trying to make like an argument against like doing things which you would not find in the body if it's left to its own devices, I mean, like, There are so many ways that we modify the body nowadays that doesn't have to do with being trans, that just seems like an irrelevant argument. Yeah, transhumanism.
All of these other external and anterior factors that Riley can drill down to the very heart of the problem. You can pump yourself full of different hormones, you can cut off your secondary sex characteristics, you can cut off your genitals, you can cut off your gonads.
I love that he reduces it down to just cutting off your genitals or whatever. These people, like, always reduce it down to, like, the most visceral descriptions as possible, right?
But you can't do anything about your chromosomes. You are stuck with these. And so Riley has to essentially demonstrate, using the definition of sex that we have, that in fact, because these things are not permanent, as in they can be physically modified, therefore they are not valid. However, that's not the case.
Doesn't have to do with validity. It has to do with, like, whether or not these things should be considered when we're trying to decide whether or not someone is biologically male or biologically female, or in fact, if those terms have any scientific validity to them at all. It doesn't really have to do with whether or not she's valid or these characteristics are valid.
The a priori assumption of what a woman is stems from the kind of chromosomes that they have, that creates the kind of body that they have, which means their secondary sex characteristics, their hormones, their genitals, their gonads, with the eventual function of producing a fertile woman. It is not wrong that definitionally women have XX chromosomes and produce ovum, whereas men have XY chromosomes and produce sperm.
Yes, it is! That is completely wrong, based on the evidence that we presented earlier. If you missed it, then rewind to that point in the video. This is probably getting pretty long at this point because he's making a lot of really fucking wrong arguments. But that's just wrong. That's just blatantly wrong. And if you try to assume, if you're trying to assert that women are biologically female by virtue of the fact that they have XY chromosomes, or XX chromosomes, and that men are biologically male by virtue of the fact that they have XY chromosomes, that's just scientifically inaccurate. It is. It is. And I've already cited the evidence to show that. That's just wrong. Yeah, and with no sources. He doesn't feel the need to provide any sort of source. He doesn't feel the need to actually prove what he's saying is true because he just assumes that the audience will take him at his word. And I love that. I absolutely love that because it makes it much easier for me to prove him wrong.
Even if some women don't produce ovum and some men don't produce sperm, if they're not capable of reproducing, even if our definition is not infallible, that doesn't mean it's not a good definition, a proper and right definition, and has real-world use.
I love that, actually. He's acknowledging that the definition isn't perfect, but that we should keep it because it has practical real-world use. I love that. He doesn't actually care about whether or not it's a scientifically accurate definition. He just wants to keep it because it's convenient for his own worldview. Hey, Carl. I understand that your feelings are very important to you. I understand that they're very important to you. But, in the words of someone who came up with a saying but drastically misappropriates it, facts don't care about your feelings. So yeah.
And since we're talking about more than 99% of the population who fall into one of these categories, XX or XY, it appears that we are talking about something real that is merely an imperfect biological process. The question really is, what do we want the strength?
Yes, just by virtue of the fact that most people fall into one of two categories means that we should try and keep that category, even though we know, even though we know and you acknowledge that there are people who don't fall into those categories. It's just an argument for preference. That's all. That's the complete appeal right now. He's just saying, you know, it might just be easier to keep the ones that we already have. You know, it's like if it works for most people, and yeah, there are some people who, you know, doesn't work for. You know, that's a rounding error. But like, hey, it works for most people, right? So let's just keep life simple. And it's like, that's not how science works, Carl. It's not about being prescriptive. It's about being descriptive. And descriptively, everything that Riley is saying right now is pretty much on point.
Strength of our justification to be. Whenever we adopt a belief, we always have some kind of justification for it. And the strength of that justification...
Yep. And my justification is that my beliefs are fundamentally rooted in scientific consensus. Boom.
Is how convincing and committed to that belief that we are. There are two schools of thought, one called fallibilism and one called infallibilism on this, and it is pretty much how it sounds. The fallibilist school of thought is into which most of our beliefs fall. Most of our beliefs and knowledge are fallibly justified.
I don't know where this is going. I don't know where this is going.
Believe something could be true, but we can't rule out the possibility of it not being true. And that really does apply for almost everything. I mean, for example, we can't prove that we are not brains in jars that have been hooked up by some mad scientist and are giving us false information and created a simulated world around us. we don't know that that's not the case. I mean, if all information we have comes through our senses, how could we prove it otherwise? But we don't really have any compelling evidence to suggest that we are brains in jars, and so it becomes the reasonable position to assume that we are in fact not brains in jars. We are looking at the real world. However, epistemologically, Riley and Lindsay have approached this from the infallibilist position. They are looking to be able to rule out the possibility of error. Now, with such...
This is a lot of mental jumping through hoops. Let's be clear. What they are doing is talking about what the majority scientific consensus is. Period. And in that sense, the reason that they believe the things that they are saying is because they have been determined through the scientific method. And that seems like a pretty good reason to believe the things that you're saying, as opposed to trying to, I'm trying to understand what you're saying, and if you ever talk to me, I'm sure that you would posture this and, well, you can't understand my argument, so therefore I must be right. But right now I'm failing to see the argument when they're talking from a position of scientific consensus and you're arguing against it.
Demonstrably flawed and imperfect beings that are life forms, that's not going to happen. You are always going to have many, many flaws, and you're going to have to be able to account for what will effectively be category errors because of an error in the process to create whatever it is you're trying to capture.
Right now it sounds like what he's saying is just a criticism of a descriptive worldview. Yeah, they're acting descriptively. They are trying to criticize or evaluate terms that we use descriptively based on what we can observe in our reality. But if you have a term like biological male, and that term, when you actually put it under scrutiny, does not really account for everything that we observe empirically in the scientific world, then yeah, that's reason to question whether or not it actually is as usable and as empirically validated as we might have prior believed. That's it. What they're doing is they're putting these terms under scrutiny according to the modern majority scientific consensus and just showing us that, yeah, they don't always apply perfectly. So we shouldn't assign them the weight that a lot of people in culture and in society do.
Categorize. This is just an aspect of life. And the thing is, what would be the problem with that? If
just an aspect of life. Yep, it's the only reason that we have to believe this. It's just an aspect of life. It's just something, it's just an intrinsic part of life. There's just an intrinsic truth and intrinsic reality that happens to, fit my preconceived worldview, like my own personally, not like yours, fuck you, the audience. But it's just a part of life. Let's just shrug and not, mess too much with it. Okay.
If someone didn't fit neatly into these categories, then surely I could just come out and ask them about it, couldn't I? Well, apparently I couldn't.
Calling a trans woman male implies to most people that she's a man, which is inaccurate. Plus, asking if someone is male or female in this context is really just asking them what their genitals are, which seems like a question that's a little too invasive to ask people most of the time. Like, if you manage to convince everyone that sex and gender are different, asking a trans woman her sex is basically just asking her what's between her
yeah.
legs. It's a polite way of getting private information about someone.
Well, yes, of course it is, but that's what the terms man and woman and male and female also do. They also reveal private information about people, and for good reason. There are significant morphological differences between men and women, which gives them different and competing desires and interests, which primarily revolve around sex and reproduction.
It's just a rehash of the reproduction argument. I'm just repeating the same thing. If he keeps making the same argument over and over, then I'm gonna end the video because I feel like I'm arguing the same thing over and over and over again.
Someone presents themselves as female, they're trying to tell other people that they're in fact in possession of a vagina and a womb, and once someone presents as male, they're actually trying to tell people that they're in possession of a penis and testicles.
Hey, I'm not sure if you were aware of this, even if it wasn't your intention, but every time that you ever communicate to someone that you're a man or a woman, the intention behind that is to communicate what your genitals are and what your reproductive function is. That's the reason. It's not, to just describe who you are. No, it's to talk about your genitals. That's what everyone is thinking about. That's what's going on in the minds of every single person when they introduce themselves. Okay.
This is actually something other people need to know. Society is built around the interactions between men and women, and so it's not...
By the way, the only person that ever has to know what's between my legs is my current romantic partner, whoever it may be at the time, and maybe my doctor. That's it. And amazingly, society does not falter or fall apart because people don't know what's between my legs.
Not surprising that they would have quite a formalized and baked-in set of rules.
If a woman has her ovaries removed due to cancer, is she no longer female? If a man has his testes removed due to cancer, is he no longer male? I don't think so, and I don't think you can say that gonads define a person's sex without believing that.
I find it interesting how everything's a spectrum until it comes to either male or female, and then, no, that's either 100% or 0%.
It's because men and women are gender identities. If you identify as something, mind you, we already talked about it earlier in the video, like a while ago, because this is going on for a while, but like, if you identify as a man, and you're objectively treated as a man in society, congratulations, according to the modern majority scientific consensus, you're a man. And same for women, and same for non-binary people. That's how gender works. Yeah.
You're either male or you are not male. There's no spectrum at all there. I think that this does exist on a spectrum, and I think losing your fertility does give you a hit to your maleness or your femaleness. And I think that's just a fact of life. It's not a very pleasant one, but it's just something that I think is true. And I think that
Hey. So it's funny, because he will acknowledge a spectrum of sexual identity in this regard. But for all the men out there, if you cannot produce sperm, apparently you are less of a man. Sorry to break it to you, but that's what Carl Boyo is saying here. Rip.
people feel that. When women go through...
By the way, he also, like, people feel that. He's just making an appeal to feeling. Like, this is just his personal preference. This is all just his personal preference. He can't cite a single site. He can't cite a single citation to actually validate what he's saying. He's just arguing from his own personal, like, his own personal preference on how he wants the world to function. That's it. That's it. If he doesn't make a new argument in, like, another couple minutes, then I'm just going to end the video, because this is just going in circles.
Through the menopause, I think they feel like less of a woman. When a man can't get an erection, I think he feels like less of a man. Because fundamentally, I do think these things are tied, in essence, to the reproductive ability of the biological organism that is the human being. But anyway, we finally come to Riley's conclusion.
If chromosomes don't determine your hormones, secondary sex characteristics, genitals, or gonads, what purpose do they serve in differentiating people? The answer is, they serve no purpose. There's no reason to...
True. Pursuant to the argument I made way earlier in the video.
Divide XX people and XY people. That is an arbitrary distinction that has no effect on how the person looks or behaves or navigates the world. Sex is not a biological fact because it is determined by things that are largely changeable, and the only part of it that is unchangeable doesn't have any real world effect. So it is just as much a social construct as gender is. So if you're a trans woman, you're female. If you're a trans man, you're male.
So I just want to make
Boom! I love it.
it perfectly clear. Chromosomes define your hormones, your secondary sex characteristics, your genitals, and your gonads. Our ability to modify these after the fact is not evidence that chromosomes have no real-world function. The distinction between men and women is not arbitrary, and it is informed by the biological differences between the imperfect categories of male and female.
Not a single citation there, Carl. Not a single thing to back that up, Carl. Not anything, just you know, taking you at your word. Because right now you're making a lot of prescriptive sounding claims there. Saying that chromosomes inform our identity as men and women. Well, it goes against the scientific consensus, and hey, if you wanna take that position, then fine, but I'm gonna be here to point out why that's wrong.
Riley has talked herself around to the exact opposite of reality for the purpose of erasing gender and sex, because these categories exclude hermaphrodites and
projection
trans people from within their definitions, and that can be exclusionary. And to be clear, I consider Riley's, and by extension Lindsay's, view on sex, gender, and epistemology to be the flat earth theory of gender theories.
Ironic.
This is obvious nonsense, and purely because Riley is demanding perfection from a system that is definitionally not perfect.
I love the argument that he's making here. We've already talked about it, but just to rehash it. The problem that he has with people like criticizing the system of biological sex is the fact that, you know, yeah, the system is imperfect, and we just shouldn't explore those imperfections because, you know, we should just let it be because it's more convenient for people, especially, you know, my own personal view on how society should function. You know, yeah, like, we have some definitions, and they might be a little bit flawed, but just leave it alone, you know, the world is better off if we don't, like, press too hard or actually, like, ask questions about why these imperfections exist. He's literally just arguing from his own personal preference of how he wants these things to function. He hasn't talked about a single citation. He hasn't talked about a single piece of empirical evidence that he's able to cite and talk about why that supports his worldview, except for an outdated view of how biological sex should be viewed from someone who existed 100 years ago that's contrary to the modern majority scientific consensus.
To be done purely for ideological reasons that are assumed to protect the feelings of trans and hermaphrodite people.
Okay. Says the person that literally is only talking about this worldview that he wants to prescribe based on how he feels. On how he feels that society should function.
After that long and what I think is a very extreme detour into a realm of pseudoscience at best, Lindsay then returns to talk about J.K. Rowling and...
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Because I really don't care about talking about J.K. Rowling. I don't care about his arguments about them. The real arguments I wanted to address from Sargon was this argument about biological sex and biological reality and how they factor in the trans people. I think that the thing that's important to recognize, and this is something that a lot of people have told me about Sargon, is that A, he doesn't ever really cite anything to actually back up his claims, except for like some very obscure conventional views that are contrary to scientific consensus. And yeah, that seems to be about right. That checks out. But also the fact that like he will use a very particular way to posture himself. But let's be clear, many times throughout there, he both misrepresented opposing arguments just drastically, right? Like basically everything that he fought against was a straw man. And then when he did articulate arguments, he just talked from how he wanted the world to operate and how he felt the world best would operate and then based on how he felt prescriptively, wow, thank you for donating, appreciate it, how he felt prescriptively the world should operate, that's the basis for how we should adopt certain definitions and certain categories. That is the opposite of operating under scientific consensus. And that is almost the definition, if not the definition, of anti-intellectualism.